Let's get more details now and more reaction to this particular story. We speak to Independent Analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Let's just start with your flat-out reaction to the latest developments.
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. So I think obviously it is quite surprising how it all suddenly just escalated over the past few hours. And I think obviously the biggest problem that we've always had with this deal was the simple question of why there was so much secrecy surrounding it, and the simple question of what it is that was so sensitive about the commercial terms of the deal that we couldn't be allowed to figure out what the state of the deal is. And I think obviously when you now look at how it's all completely collapsed, the minister is probably more embarrassed than anything else, because in spite of many people having asked legitimately for information, he insisted that he knew better. He insisted that only he could get the deal across the line. And unfortunately, it's turned out to be a spectacular failure. And
especially because you even listened to what has come out of Parliament in this particular regard. They were looking for certain documents, the sale agreements and all of that. And these documents simply not forthcoming. And at some point, he shows up in Parliament, but then the media not being able to hear what is coming out from that. So the secrecy, as you say, really continued to get a lot of people talking on this one.
Yeah, and I think if we now go back to how it all started, obviously, when the deal was firstly mooted as one of the solutions in which the state was going to deal with the question of how to manage public enterprises that had become a drain on the fiscus, a lot of people were curious about whether this could become the template of how other state entities were going to be repurposed and restructured. Now, obviously, the ideological debates around whether that should have been happening in the first place were superseded by the fact that when National Treasury says that there'll be no more bailout, somebody had to come up with an alternative way of dealing with the issue. So over the past couple of years, it's been a deal that's been keenly observed on the basis that we thought we would learn particular things about, firstly, how the state ought to engage with these particular questions, and also, more importantly, how to manage that transition process. Unfortunately, with this deal, rather than being the template for us learning about what not to do and how things should or shouldn't be done, we were all left in the dark about what was going on. It also became very clear that even the basis of those that were selected to be part of the deal was a matter of dispute, and we know that the former Director General has been very clear that the process did not follow any particularly, transparent means. So throughout this process, the minister has really not done himself any favors by firstly refusing to engage substantively with the information, but also in the way in which he treated those that were legitimately asking for information. It was very dismissive, and it did not endear him to anyone, even those that were curious about what the deal was about. So I think that in the past 2 or 3 years, he has nailed his mast to this deal. And of course, this deal has become his great undermining.
And, Khaya, you talk about, the former DG. One of the things that was also clear from him and what he was also saying in public was that, the Takatso Consortium undervalued SAA. And this is also another concern that was also shared by some of the MPs in Parliament, and also given some of the information that he also, revealed to Parliament around this particular deal. How crucial was what he had to say to, Parliament, especially around some of what we are seeing unfolding right now around this deal?
I think his disclosures definitely made it very easy, much easier for the Portfolio Committee in particular to know the type of questions that they needed to ask. And I think the reality here is that for as long as the minister maintained a cloak of secrecy, it meant that even those accountability mechanisms actually had nothing to work on, because they actually did not know what they were looking at. So from the moment the deal started being presented as a potential, option, the first question was obviously the valuation. That was quite important, not because we knew better than him on how to value assets, but because the manner in which it had been presented simply indicated that the airline was essentially worthless, which is where the 51 Rand number came from. So obviously, from the last time that we had seen the financial statements of SAA, which had been many, many years earlier, there was an element of curiosity about, well, how really worthless was this particular airline if the minister said that, look, we simply have to exchange the shares for this nominal 51 rand number. So that sense of curiosity is something that would have been addressed by, firstly, the publication of the financial statements of the SAA. That on its own took a long time, but also more importantly, an explanation of what went into the decision-making process and the valuation process that ended up with the minister and the prospective buyers deciding that this is the way in which the deal needed to exchange hands. The secondary problem, of course, was the question of what happened to the historical liabilities, and the minister wasn't very clear on how those needed to be dealt with. And then we heard that there was a 3 billion rand that may or may not exchange hands long after we thought a deal had been concluded.
Now, Khaya, looking ahead, the minister saying that, and I'm borrowing from some of what he says, SAA can sustain itself for the next year to 18 months, and there will be other means that this entity that have been put in place that it can use to be able to generate, funds should it need to. It will not dip into the fiscus. They must run, a very tight ship and make sure that their operations are as efficient as possible. I wonder then, looking at what we've seen in the past and where we are now with SAA, is this something that you are confident can happen?
No, and I think we need to be very clear at this particular point in time that the minister is not exactly accountable for anything that materializes after the 20th of May. So he could easily come back many years down the line and say, well, at the point in time when he made this presentation, which was today, those are the undertakings that he had been given. We also know that the minister, in many instances relating to this particular portfolio of public enterprises, whether it's the Eskom situation, whether you're talking about Transnet or even SAA, obviously he has made particular presentations based on what we assume had been given to him as undertakings by the boards and the management of those particular entities. And in many instances, those things simply never materialized. So even in this one, the fact that he feels bold enough to be able to say that this entity can sustain itself for the next 12 to 18 months, it means that this particular entity has undertaken what we refer to as a going concern assessment. They have said over the next 12 to 18 months, this is what we need to do, and this is how we're going to finance what we need to do. Now, obviously, that would be a wonderful thing that if they did, but then you come back to the announcement today that seems to say that, well, actually, when the deal was first put together, the particular dynamics in the aviation sector and in the economy were at a particular level. The minister cited some of those. So you can imagine that a minister who's been engaged in a deal where clearly the inputs and the expectations around the deal proved to be so completely out of line with what he thought they were going to be, for him to then sit today and tell us what he knows or imply that he knows what those conditions might be in the next 12 or 18 months, the market conditions, the operating conditions, and the fact that this entity will still be able to sustain itself, it does feel like it's a bit of an ambitious foray into speculation, and I doubt that the minister can be able to defend the statement that he made where he says that for the next 18 months this airline will be viable, because the reason we're talking today is that his predictions about what this entity can do and his predictions about what that partnership ought to have done, well, they've turned out to be completely false, haven't they?
It's going to be an interesting road ahead. Khaya, thank you so much for giving us your perspective there. Do appreciate it. That was Khaya Sithole, Independent Analyst, and we do of course have a statement as well from Takatso and Bulelwa. In fact, Lula Mamakya was watching that particular briefing for us and will bring us up to speed as to what came out from that particular briefing. We'll give you more on this particular developing story.